She barked orders like she owned the room until the quiet man she shoved aside revealed he was the new commander. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate. He just listened and let the truth expose itself. Why would a leader stay silent in the face of disrespect? If that question lingers in your mind, just like this story will, share it with someone who believes respect is earned through action, not authority. It was a Wednesday morning, thick with unease in Maple Ridge County Courthouse. The kind of day where the sun refused to shine too brightly, and even the coffee tasted like it knew something was off. Inside courtroom 2A, the air was too still. A crowd had gathered: neighbors, community activists, a few journalists pretending to check their phones. They weren't here for the case. They were here for the tension it brought. At the defense table sat Officer Karen Bell Blonde, decorated and unbothered. Her uniform was crisp, her eyes sharp. She glanced around the room like a hostess rather than a defendant. The charges: excessive force against a minor, but not just any minor, Tyrone Wells, a 13-year-old black boy whose only crime had been walking home from the corner store with a grape soda. Across from her, Monica Wells gripped her worn leather purse like it held her son's breath. Tyrone wasn't in court. He was still recovering, wrist in a cast, bruises fading, but the silence in his eyes hadn't healed. Monica hadn't slept. She didn't need to. The image of her son's face, bloodied and confused, was stitched into her every blink. The judge, Harvey Dumas, old and distant, shifted in his chair like the case annoyed him more than it troubled him. He didn't meet Monica's eyes when she walked in. He rarely did. Then, the door creaked. A man stepped inside, tall, calm, and dressed in a gray coat too plain to matter. And yet it somehow did. He wasn't young. He wasn't old. Just centered. He didn't speak. Didn't glance at the cameras or the crowd. Just scanned the room once and took a seat 3 rows from the back. He carried no briefcase, no badge, no threat. But something about the way he folded his hands over a slim leather notebook made the air shift around him. Nathaniel Rhodes didn't need to introduce himself. He came to see what justice looked like when it didn't know it was being watched. Karen noticed him. Not right away, but eventually. Her gaze slid toward him, narrowing slightly. She leaned toward her lawyer and whispered something with a smirk. Her attorney didn't smile back. The bailiff called the room to order. Monica Wells stood slowly, every step up to the witness stand weighed down by memory. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from carrying too much truth too long. She told them what her son had said through tears. "Mama, I didn't do anything. She just hit me." Karen didn't flinch. She didn't need to. But behind her, in that 3rd row seat, Nathaniel adjusted the pen in his hand and began to write. The courtroom buzzed faintly during recess. The kind of low murmur that sounded like bees behind glass, dangerous only if you leaned too close. People shifted in their seats. A few reporters scribbled notes, unsure if what they were witnessing was courtroom drama or something deeper unraveling beneath it all. Karen Bell stood near the defense table, one hand on her hip, the other casually twirling a pen. Her expression was cool, calculated. This wasn't fear. It was confidence laced with entitlement. She had faced scrutiny before: minor scandals, internal reviews, quiet complaints that vanished like smoke in policy folders. This would be no different, except there was him, that man in gray. He hadn't said a word since entering the courtroom. hadn't looked at her directly, but somehow she felt the weight of his attention without seeing his eyes. She hated that his silence made her wonder. Karen turned to Officer Ron Tully, seated 2 chairs down. She leaned in close enough for only him to hear. "You see that guy," she whispered, her tone edged with scorn. "Third row, gray coat, been scribbling since the hearing started." Ron nodded slightly without looking. "Comes in here with that quiet, righteous energy like he's writing a novel on systemic oppression," she muttered. "Betty posts it on LinkedIn later." Ron exhaled through his nose, something between a chuckle and caution. "Careful," he said low. "You don't know who he is." Karen's lips curled into a grin. "Exactly, which means he's no one." And with that, she stepped away, her mind already crafting the next move. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed, not loudly, but in a way that could be felt beneath the skin, like a shift in weather unseen, but undeniable. Nathaniel sat exactly as before, still, calm, his notebook open, pen resting gently between his fingers. Karen approached the witness stand to give her testimony. She stood tall, reciting her version of the encounter with rehearsed precision. "He lunged at me," she said, her voice firm. "He was erratic, possibly under the influence. I had to act quickly to protect myself and the public." Her lawyer nodded with each phrase, like a conductor approving every note of a dishonest symphony. Across the room, Monica Wells sat frozen. She couldn't cry anymore. Not here. Not where every tear would be interpreted as theatrics. So she folded her hands, locked her jaw, and stared at the floor. And still Nathaniel wrote. It wasn't until after lunch, during a brief moment of unguarded hallway pause, that Karen made her move. Nathaniel had stepped outside the courtroom, standing near a marble pillar, flipping through his notebook. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't seeking attention either. Just there, like gravity in a coat. Karen approached slowly. No badge, no uniform, just her words. "Bit unusual to take so many notes," she said, her voice casual. Nathaniel didn't answer. "Most people like to watch the show, not transcribe it," she continued, stepping closer. "Unless you're planning to make trouble." He looked at her for the first time. No challenge, no curiosity, just patience. Karen smiled without warmth. "You think silence gives you power, don't you? Like all that quiet means you're better than the rest of us." Still, he said nothing. She leaned in just enough for her voice to drop a pitch. "Let me tell you something. Stranger, I know you're kind. Watching from the sidelines, thinking you're above it all." She reached into her coat pocket, slow, practiced, and with the smoothness of routine. She slipped a small folded document into Nathaniel's inner jacket pocket, a movement so subtle it looked like a handshake from a distance. "There," she whispered. "Let's see how quiet you stay when security finds that." Moments later, as everyone filed back into the courtroom, Officer Tully approached Nathaniel. "Sir," he said respectfully but firmly, "do you mind if we check your coat?" Nathaniel gave a slight nod. No resistance, no panic. Tully reached inside the pocket and pulled out the folded document. Karen watched from across the room, arms crossed. It was a classified internal affairs report, restricted material, stamped confidential. Gasps echoed softly. Karen's smile returned, small, almost imperceptible, but present. "Sir," Officer Ramirez asked, frowning, Can you explain how this ended up in your possession? Nathaniel looked at the paper, then at both officers. His face remained still, his eyes unreadable. He shook his head once. That was it. Not denial, not confession, just stillness. From the gallery, Angela Howard, a court clerk who had been watching silently all day, narrowed her eyes. She had seen the hallway exchange. She knew what she'd seen, but she said nothing for now. The courtroom buzzed again. The judge banged the gavel. Order in the room. This is a civil hearing, not a circus. But something had changed. Something real. Karen had expected silence to protect her. She didn't realize it was the quiet that had already begun exposing her. And as she retook her seat, back straight, chin lifted, she glanced once more at Nathaniel. He was already writing again, slow, even lines, one after another. She didn't know his name, not yet, but soon. The entire room would. By the time the bailiff called the court back to order, something in the room had shifted. Not the temperature, not the light, the trust. It had thinned, like a wire stretched too far, fraying beneath the surface. Karen Bell sat tall, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable, but only to those who hadn't been watching closely. Her eyes darted, her jaw flexed once, and just briefly, her fingers tapped a rhythm against the table knot nerves, but control on the verge of slipping. She scanned the room. The judge, Harvey Duma, remained unimpressed. He glanced at his docket with the weariness of a man who had long ago stopped listening and started managing optics. As far as he was concerned, this case was already decided. The boy had healed. The cop had her badge. The system had done its job. Time to move on. He didn't notice the shift, but others did. In the third row, Nathaniel Rhodes closed his notebook and placed it gently on his lap. He stood calm, measured, unhurried. No announcement, no flourish. Just a quiet man rising when the moment required it. He stepped forward. The room followed his motion as if pulled by an unseen tide. Even Judge Dumas looked up, startled not by volume but by presence. "Your Honor," Nathaniel began, his voice low but razor clear. "There's no need to continue this hearing." The judge blinked. "Excuse me." Nathaniel reached into his coat and withdrew a slim, leather-bound badge wallet. He placed it flat on the edge of the bench. Nathaniel Rhodes, Chief of Internal Affairs for Maple Ridge County, appointed last week by executive order of the governor. A collective inhale swept across the gallery. Karen's face drained of color. Her hand froze mid-tap. From the corner of the courtroom, Angela Howard dropped her pen. In the back, a court clerk spilled a pitcher of water. The badge shimmered under the fluorescent lights, unimpeachable, unignorable. Nathaniel continued, "I came here today not to intervene, but to observe, to see how justice is handled when it believes no one of consequence is watching. I've seen enough." The judge leaned back, uncertain. "This is highly irregular." "No," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "What's irregular is a courtroom that silences grieving mothers, defends planted evidence, and dismisses harm done to a child like it's a footnote." He turned slowly first to the gallery, then to Monica Wells. Her eyes welled, not with pain this time, but with the unsteady relief of finally being seen. "Your son didn't lunge," Nathaniel said. "He didn't threaten. He walked home with a soda, and for that, he was punished. by the one person meant to protect him. Karen stood suddenly, her voice sharp. This is outrageous. You can't hijack a hearing. You already did, Nathaniel replied. The room hushed again. From the gallery, someone whispered, He's not even angry. And he wasn't. That was the part that unnerved them the most. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't demanding. He was certain. Nathaniel pulled a small USB from his coat pocket, stepped to the court's media desk, and plugged it in. A screen flickered to life. Surveillance footage. The hallway. Earlier that day. Karen approaching him. The subtle hand slip into his pocket. The folded document. The moment he was framed captured clearly on camera. Gasps erupted. A second file played audio. From the precinct locker room. Karen's voice chilling. Unmistakable. They don't need provocation. Push them a little, and they show their true face. Even Judge Dumas went pale. Nathaniel returned to the center of the courtroom. The footage and audio were submitted anonymously, but that doesn't matter, because truth doesn't need a name. It just needs to be seen. He paused. In my 2 days as chief, I've already uncovered 6 complaints against Officer Bellall, dismissed under this court's jurisdiction, all eerily similar. He opened his notebook, each page marked, tabbed, annotated. He read names, described injuries, listed inconsistencies. Then he looked at Judge Dumas. Sir, the real question isn't what Officer Bell did. It's how many people helped her get away with it, and how many more are willing to stay silent now. The judge tried to speak. He couldn't. Outside, sirens wailed, not panicked, but precise. Through the courtroom doors stepped a man in a dark suit and federal badge. Agent Victor Shaw, Department of Justice. He walked straight to the bench, handed the judge an envelope. Effective immediately. This court is under federal review. The chief's report was verified. Internal corruption, case suppression, disregard for evidence. He turned to Nathaniel. We're ready. Karen backed away slowly, her hands curled into fists, then opened again. She looked at Nathaniel, as if seeing him for the first time. You think this changes anything, she said bitterly. One hearing, one speech. No, Nathaniel replied, but it starts something. The room erupted, not in applause, but in motion. Cameras clicked, reporters pushed forward. But Nathaniel didn't stay for the spectacle. He turned, nodded once to Monica and Tyrone, who had now entered the room. His arm still wrapped in cloth, but his chin lifted. Then he walked away. No raised fist, no pointed finger. Just a man who came to listen and ended up making the system speak. For a full 5 seconds after Nathaniel Rhodes stepped away from the screen, the courtroom didn't move. No one breathed loudly. No one shuffled papers. Even the judge's gavel lay untouched, as if it too was stunned into silence. The playback of the surveillance footage and audio had left the courtroom gasping not from spectacle, but recognition. Everyone had seen pieces of this story before, in headlines, in protests, in hashtags, but not like this, not inside these walls, not with the truth dressed in silence and evidence so precise it sliced through decades of denial. Judge Harvey Dumas sat stiff, his lips pursed so tightly they seemed to vanish into his face. He cleared his throat, but no words followed. There were none that wouldn't betray his role in all of it. The federal agent, Victor Shaw, turned to face the courtroom. By order of the Department of Justice, he said clearly. This court is no longer under local jurisdiction. All hearings are suspended pending a formal investigation into civil rights violations and judicial misconduct. He walked to the side of the room, where several federal officers stood by in dark suits. Karen Bell still hadn't moved. She was frozen, not by fear, but by calculation. Her eyes darted between faces, looking for anyone who would step in, a fellow officer, a superior, even the judge. No one moved, not even Ron Tully, especially not him. Agent Shaw spoke again, this time directly to Karen. "Officer Bell, you are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, abuse of power, and civil assault under color of authority." The room exhaled, but Karen wasn't done. "You're making a mistake," she snapped, standing tall as two agents approached. "You think this little stunt proves something? You think the world's going to believe a quiet man with a notebook over a decorated officer?" No one replied, because she already had her answer. The agents took her gently but firmly by the arms. Karen turned to Nathaniel. Her voice dipped, venom beneath the calm. "You'll regret this. All of you will. This isn't justice. It's theater." Nathaniel looked at her, not with anger, not even judgment, just certainty. "No," he said, "it's a mirror." As Karen was led out in cuffs, her badge removed and clipped into an evidence bag, a ripple of disbelief rolled through the room. The weight of years of dismissed complaints, ignored mothers, and unseen bruises felt like it had finally landed on solid ground. Monica Wells covered her mouth with her hand. Tyrone sat beside her now, his hand resting gently on hers. He hadn't spoken much since the attack, but today, he whispered. "Is it over?" Monica's voice cracked. "No, baby. But it's finally starting." Judge Dumas tried once more to salvage his position. He stood, cleared his throat. "This court has," but Victor Shaw raised a hand. "Judge Dumas, as of this moment, your authority is suspended pending a federal review. If you resist this order, it will be considered obstruction." The judge faltered, then sat. His face collapsed inward, not from guilt, but the realization that his era had just ended. Nathaniel turned to the gallery. His voice carried without needing to rise. "I didn't come here to make a statement. I came because the silence had gone on too long, because for every mother ignored, for every child who learned to fear instead of trust, the system has owed an answer." He held up his leather-bound notebook. "In here are names, not statistics, people." Then he looked at Tyrone. And today, the system finally had to say their names out loud. Outside, the courthouse plaza was filling, not with protesters, with citizens. No shouting, no chanting, just a sea of people holding photos, candles, and folded letters. The mood wasn't rage, it was relief with tears still drying. Reporters were everywhere now, but Nathaniel didn't walk outside. Instead, he stepped into the judge's chamber room, once filled with whispered corruption, and handed Agent Shaw a thick binder. 317 pages, each one an affidavit, testimony, or buried report tied to the judicial failures of Maple Ridge County. Victor skimmed a few pages and nodded. "This will rewrite the story of this courthouse." "No," Nathaniel replied. "It'll finally tell the truth." An hour later, a woman approached the bench. She was slender, gray at the temples, wearing a modest blazer and soft eyes full of quiet fire. She held a tablet in one hand and a trembling breath in the other. "I'm Elaine Spencer," she said. Community legal advocate. We've gathered 38,000 signatures online calling for Judge Dumas' permanent removal and a full community-led oversight committee for all future court proceedings. She placed the tablet gently on the desk. Nathaniel stepped forward and added his voice, soft but absolute, and I support it. Meanwhile, Karen Bell sat in the back of a federal van, eyes fixed on nothing. She wasn't crying, she wasn't yelling, she was calculating, but no calculation could undo what was already set in motion. Because outside, the photo of her being escorted away had already gone viral. And inside, the boy she tried to silence was smiling for the first time in weeks. When the van pulled off, Nathaniel emerged at last into the light. A young man with a news badge ran up, microphone trembling. Chief Rhodes, what message do you have for Maple Ridge? Nathaniel paused. Then he said only this: justice doesn't arrive with noise. It walks in quietly. But when it speaks, it rewrites everything. By the time the sun began to lower behind the courthouse roof, the plaza outside had transformed. There were no barricades, no megaphones, just people. Dozens at first, then hundreds, then more. They didn't come to shout. They came to stand together. Some held signs, but not with slogans. Just names. Names of brothers, daughters, nephews, and neighbors. Names that had once been filed away in police reports and court records, now being reclaimed in candlelight and ink. Others came with nothing but presence. And presence, in this moment, was everything. Inside the courthouse, the halls were quieter now. Echoes didn't sound defensive. They carried something new: reflection. Nathaniel Rhodes sat in the judge's chambers, a desk lamp casting soft light over pages and names and case numbers that had once been forgotten. He didn't need a press conference. He didn't ask for interviews. But every time a new message arrived from a teacher, a mother, a retired postal worker, it felt like a door had been cracked open in a place long sealed shut. One message read, "For 19 years, I taught my students the justice system is fair. Today, I finally believe it can be." Another, "My son was arrested for loitering. He was standing outside his own apartment. You didn't raise your voice, Chief, but we all heard you." He read each one, every line, because Nathaniel believed something most had forgotten. Justice is personal. It begins with one person standing so someone else doesn't have to kneel. At dusk, Monica Wells and Tyrone returned. They didn't go into the courtroom. They went to the plaza. Tyrone's cast had been removed. His wrist was still tender. But that day, he didn't hold it like it was broken. He held it like it remembered. He watched the candles, the signs, the faces that looked like his. And he asked his mother, "Did we start this?" Monica wrapped an arm around his shoulder. We reminded them why it had to start. In the crowd, Angela Howard, the quiet court clerk who had seen everything unfold from the sidelines, found herself approached by a young woman with a notebook. "Were you in the room when it happened?" she asked. Angela nodded. And Angela looked toward the courthouse steps, where Nathaniel now stood speaking with an older man in a veteran's cap. She smiled. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just watched and made the truth louder than anyone else ever could. Across the county, change was rippling fast and wide. City council members who had once dodged accountability now returned voicemails before they rang twice. Police precincts opened their books for community review. Internal affairs departments, once faceless, now hosted open forums. And at the center of it all was a man in a gray coat. often seated silently in the third row, still writing, because this wasn't about image, it was about momentum. A few blocks from the courthouse, a local high school held its first student-led civic meeting. They talked about law, about rights, about fear. One boy, maybe 15, raised his hand and said, "I used to think silence meant weakness, but that man showed us sometimes silence is stronger than shouting." A teacher wrote it down on the whiteboard. Strength doesn't always need volume. Later that night, Nathaniel walked alone. The courthouse lawn had quieted. Candles still flickered like constellations in the grass. An old man hummed a gospel tune softly while folding chairs were stacked nearby. And then a voice behind him, "Chief Rhodes." He turned. A young girl, no older than 10, stood nervously holding a folded piece of paper. "My teacher said you're the reason they're changing the rules," she said. Nathaniel knelt, gently taking the note from her hand. It was a drawing of him standing between a child and a judge's bench. The caption was written in purple crayon. "You saw me." Nathaniel smiled, carefully folding the paper. "I did," he said, "and one day you'll do the same for someone else." She grinned before running off toward her parents. Inside his office, Nathaniel opened his worn leather notebook again. He turned to the final page. Blank. At the top, he wrote one word, "beginning." Then he leaned back and let the weight of the day settle not on his shoulders, but into the space behind him, the one now filled with voices no longer silenced. And while the national headlines called him the silent sheriff, and television anchors replayed his speech with awestruck commentary, Nathaniel refused to believe this was about him. It was about every person who had waited too long to be heard. And now that the world was listening, he wasn't going to be the only one speaking. He picked up a letter from his desk. It was from a boy named Khalil in Mississippi, handwritten in blue ink. "Dear Chief Rhodes, my brother says real heroes wear capes, but I think they wear gray coats. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for just standing." Outside us in the quiet where history had just shifted, the people didn't celebrate with shouts or music. They simply stood, not in defiance, but in something better. Recognition. The morning light crept gently through the window, blinds of Nathaniel's office. Unlike the harsh fluorescence of courtrooms or the flash bulbs of reporters, this light was quiet, honest. It traced the spine of a worn leather notebook on his desk, its edges soft from use. The last page marked only with one word, "beginning." Nathaniel Rhodes sat still, just as he had in courtroom 2A, the day everything changed. His coat was draped over the back of his chair, the same gray one, the same weight. But it no longer carried just notes. It carried expectation, hope, and something rarer, trust. He opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of letters. Not emails, not tweets. Letters folded, handwritten, sometimes with smudged ink or crayon-colored corners. Each one a story from someone who had felt invisible, forgotten, now awakened. One came from a retired police officer in Detroit. "You reminded me what I swore to protect, not the badge, but the people behind it." Another from a 12-year-old in New Mexico. "My teacher made us write about who we want to be. I picked you because you listened when others talked." He laid them out gently, like photographs of a movement that didn't march. It watched and waited, and spoke only when the silence had something worth breaking. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel walked the corridors of the newly restructured courthouse. A fresh coat of paint covered the once-stained walls. A bulletin board near the front desk now held public schedules for officer reviews, community hearings, and open-door policies. It wasn't revolution, it was renovation. But the foundation had shifted. In the main hallway, a plaque had been installed, subtle, brushed bronze, no bigger than a clipboard. It read, dedicated to every voice that was silenced. May we never need to raise ours to be heard again. No names, no signature, just a promise. Angela Howard, the court clerk who had once sat quietly watching Karen Bell's manipulation unfold, now led training for all new courthouse employees. Her first lesson wasn't about filing, it was about listening. Pay attention, she'd say, because the truth doesn't always yell. Sometimes it walks in wearing gray and just sits. Elsewhere, Tyrone Wells had returned to school. His wrist had healed, but more importantly, his silence had cracked. When his history teacher asked students to give a presentation on American justice, Tyrone stood in front of the class, not with a slideshow, but with a single sentence written on the chalkboard. Justice should never depend on how loud you can afford to scream. He paused, then added quietly, "That's what I learned from him." He didn't need to explain who him was. They all knew. One evening, weeks later, Nathaniel received a letter with no return address. Inside, it held a single Polaroid photo. Karen Bell, in an orange jumpsuit, seated behind a glass panel. No note, just her eyes, no longer sharp, no longer calculating, only tired. He didn't smile. He didn't frame it. He simply turned the photo over and wrote 4 words. System remembered, person forgotten, then placed it in a folder labeled History, Not Vengeance. As the months passed, news networks turned their attention elsewhere. New stories, new outrage. That's the way of the world. But Maple Ridge held on, because what had happened here wasn't just news. It was a shift in how a community saw itself. One Saturday afternoon, on the lawn outside the courthouse, a small group gathered, no microphones, no speeches, just chalk, candles, and folding chairs. Children drew outlines of gray coats in pastel blue and wrote inside them. He didn't shout, he stood, and we stood with him. That night, as the wind picked up and the candles flickered, Monica Wells walked quietly to Nathaniel's office. She didn't knock. She just stood in the doorway, her eyes glistening. He looked up and offered a chair. She didn't take it. "I just came to say," she whispered. "I saw him smile last week." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "That's where justice begins," he said. "No," she replied, voice trembling. "That's where healing begins." Later, alone again, Nathaniel returned to his notebook, but instead of writing a new entry, he flipped back. He reread the names: Tyrone Wells, Jacqueline Hughes, Mason Green, Juliana Ortiz, people who'd once been reduced to paperwork, now remembered, now heard. At dawn the next morning, a call came in from Washington. A promotion, national oversight, a new position, higher profile. Nathaniel listened quietly, then declined. "I'm not done here yet," he said, because for him, legacy wasn't a stage. It was a bench in a quiet courtroom. It was a boy who smiled again. It was the silence before the gavel drops, and the courage to let it. The courthouse lawn no longer felt like the place where justice had failed. It had become something else, a starting line. On a bright spring afternoon, a small group of students gathered outside its steps, each one holding a folder filled with handwritten policy proposals, advocacy plans, and letters from local families. They weren't there for extra credit. They were there because someone once sat in the back row and listened. Tyrone Wells, now 15, stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "We're not waiting for someone to fix it anymore," he said. "We're starting from here." Behind him stood Zoe Harrison, daughter of a public defender. Beside her, Carlos Martin, whose older brother had once been wrongly convicted and later exonerated. Each of them carried not just statistics but stories, stories they were ready to rewrite. Nathaniel watched from a distance. He wasn't in uniform, no badge, just the same gray coat, the same steady eyes. But this time, he didn't approach the podium. He didn't need to. He saw it in the way Tyrone stood, in the way Monica clutched her son's shoulder, not out of fear, but pride. The next voice had already risen. Later that evening, as the courthouse lights dimmed, Nathaniel walked alone past the lawn now scattered with chalk messages and paper lanterns. One message, written in bold yellow. He never raised his voice, so we could find our own. He paused, then kept walking, because justice had found new legs, and silence, once a shield, had become a foundation. In a world where noise often overshadows truth, this story reminds us that real power doesn't always arrive with volume. It arrives with clarity, integrity, and quiet courage. Nathaniel Rhodes didn't shout to be heard. He listened. He observed. And when the moment came, he stood not to dominate, but to reveal. Through his calm resolve, he showed that true justice isn't about revenge or spectacle, but about restoring dignity to those who were ignored and forgotten. The story teaches us that you don't need a title to lead, nor applause to make an impact. Sometimes, the most powerful changes begin with silence, with choosing to do what's right when no one is watching, and continuing even when everyone finally is. And perhaps the most profound lesson legacy isn't what we leave behind, it's what we awaken in others. So live in a way that lets someone else stand taller because you stood first quietly, firmly, and without fear. Because sometimes the most important revolutions walk in without a sound.